Copyright in these lectures is either owned by the ANU or a third party who has licensed the ANU to use it. Students may use the recording for personal study only. No lecture may be communicated online, copied or shared without the prior permission of the ANU.
Hopefully the portable microphone unit will be able to last me for the next 15 minutes or so. That is because someone did not replace the microphone unit in the charging unit correctly. So as a result, this unit was flat, I mean the battery. But in any case, let me just extend the capture by 5 minutes as usual so that we don't get cut off at the very last minute. Okay, and let's continue from where we have left off yesterday. So again, the relevant set of slides that you should go to would be found in topic 4 of the WALT website. So let me just bring up the set of slides. So what I would do is I would move to where we have stopped yesterday. Okay, so that's slide number 5. And at the same time, what I'd like to do is I'd like to switch over to document camera 1. And do a quick review of what we have covered so far. Okay. So according to yesterday's discussion, we talked about the functions of FAM, the foreign exchange market. Essentially, it helps to transfer purchasing power, and I think that is something that is quite straightforward to understand. And at the same time, it helps to provide credit. So if you want to borrow or lend money using different currencies, that can also be facilitated. In addition, the FAM also facilitates the hedging against exchange rate risk. Okay, specifically, multinational corporations may be exposed to different kinds of exchange rate risk as a result of fluctuations in the exchange rate. So in order to eliminate any uncertainty associated with these fluctuations, sometimes multinational corporations may resort to derivative instruments or any other kinds of instruments that will provide some kind of insurance against this kind of risk. Right? So essentially, these are the functions of FAM. And then I move on to talk about the size of the foreign exchange market, and to also give you some kind of overview as to the different kinds of currencies that are commonly traded in the market. Right? So I mentioned terms like safe haven currencies, commodity currencies, and carry trade currencies. So what are examples of safe haven currencies? US dollar, Japanese yen, and the Swiss franc. Okay. And US dollar, I think, is quite straightforward to understand as to why it is considered a safe haven. Because partly in part because of its strong economic fundamentals and the fact that it has such a big influence on the rest of the global economy. And if anything goes awry in the process, when people realize that global financial markets are not working well and sentiment deteriorates, typically people move to the US dollar. And what they would like to do is they would typically like to park their funds in things like treasury bills or treasury bonds, because these are viewed as risk-free assets. In fact, for those of you who have taken other courses in finance, you would have learned this concept called risk-free rate. And a typical proxy that is used for a risk-free rate is the US Treasury bill, or maybe the US Treasury bond rate. Right? Okay, and the reason has to do with the fact that this US dollar is considered such a supreme currency. Okay, its status is still not overtaken by any other currency in the world. Not yet. Okay. Yeah, so apart from the United States dollar, the Japanese yen, the Swiss franc, we've also talked about commodity currencies. And these currencies are the ones that would move in tandem with commodity cycles. So what are commodities? Things like iron ore, precious metals, even diamonds or other kinds of commodities that will be used by industries to produce other kinds of output. Right? So commodity prices actually move through booms and busts, so there are cycles to it. And depending on the demand and supply of commodities, the prices will fluctuate. And given the fact that some countries are focused on commodity exports, it is quite intuitive to find that their currencies would tend to move in tandem with commodity cycles. So for instance, the Aussie dollar, it tends to move in tandem with the commodity cycles because this country exports a lot of primary commodities like iron, uranium, etc. So other examples of commodity currencies will include the South African rand, Canadian dollar, and even the Kiwi. Okay. Now, what about carry trade currencies? Carry trade currencies are typically exploited by traders by taking advantage of interest rate differentials. And what these traders would typically assume is that at the end of the investment, the exchange rate will remain relatively stable. Of course, this is a very big assumption because we don't know what is going to happen 3 months, 6 months, or 12 months down the road. But in any case, what these traders like to do is they like to exploit these interest rate differentials by borrowing in the low interest yielding currency and then investing in the high interest yielding currency. And then when that investment matures, they would repatriate those funds back to the original destination, exchange it according to the spot rate then, and hopefully be able to benefit from the interest rate differential. So a very common example of a carry trade that is being carried out is the Japanese yen Aussie dollar carry trade. So what traders typically like to do is they like to borrow the Japanese yen because it is low in terms of its interest rate, so your borrowing costs are manageable, and then invest in the Aussie dollar because the Aussie dollar is really high in terms of its interest rate. And assuming that everything runs smoothly at the end of the day, exchange rates remain relatively stable. That is a very big assumption. They would send back the funds back to the original destination and then exchange it according to that exchange rate then, and hopefully be able to earn from the interest rate differential. Okay. We will talk about carry trade in greater detail when we come to topic 5, and I think that is the topic on arbitrage and speculation. We will look at many different kinds of arbitrage situations, and one type of arbitrage situation would be that carried out by the carry traders. And more formally, it's typically called the uncovered interest arbitrage. Uncovered in the sense that carry trading essentially it's a naked position. A naked position in the sense that the traders do not cover themselves in terms of the exchange rate risk that they may have to face as a result of carrying out this kind of transaction. Okay, now let's switch back to the PC, and I'll place this slide on document camera 2. So I was talking about the size of the foreign exchange market, and if you were to refer to the next 2 slides, okay, they give us an indication of how trading is growing from strength to strength since 1989. Okay. And this is not surprising given the fact that forces of globalization will require multinational corporations to work in different countries. And whenever you have transactions in different countries, what you need to do is you most likely would need transactions involving foreign exchange. So it's not surprising that global foreign exchange turnover is increasing since 1989. Okay, that is the positive trend. And if you were to look at the contribution coming from Australia, that is also quite sizable. Right? In terms of the trend, it's also increasing quite a lot. And that, I guess, has a lot to do with forces of globalization, with increased mobility of goods and services, plus the fact that financial markets are getting more and more integrated. We would expect foreign exchange turnover to increase in tandem. Okay, then I was talking about this impact of the global financial crisis, GFC, on the Aussie dollar. Okay. And as I've mentioned before, in terms of the notation, we have to be consistent so that we know what we are talking about. So when we say US dollar slash Aussie dollar, USD slash AUD, it means how many US dollars for one Aussie dollar. In contrast, if we were to say AUD slash USD, then that would be Aussie dollar per US dollar. And that would mean how many Aussie dollars you need in order to buy one US dollar. So that is the reverse in terms of the code. And both types of codes are actually being used. We will come to the explanation of the codes in a moment. But suffice to say that there are two different kinds of codes. Okay? One would be called the direct code, and the other one would be called the indirect code. So the direct code would be how many units of your own currency you need in order to buy the foreign currency. So it's like treating that foreign currency as some kind of a good, a commodity, and you want to evaluate how much you need in order to buy it. Right? So for instance, for a Chinese resident, what happens is he or she will be thinking about how many Chinese yuan I would need in order to get one Aussie dollar. So that code would be CNY slash AUD. Right? And the opposite would be AUD slash CNY. That would be from the perspective of the Australian resident. How many Aussie dollars do I need in order to buy one Chinese yuan? Okay? So from that perspective, AUD slash CNY is the direct code, okay, for the Aussie resident. Okay, now, I've talked about this graph, and what I want to do next is to talk about this one, which is more interesting in terms of its insights that it can provide us. So if you look at this graph, we have the blue line indicating the nominal US dollar, Aussie dollar exchange rate. So bear in mind that we're talking about how many US dollars we need in order to get one Aussie dollar. So from the perspective of the US resident, that is considered a direct code, right? It's how many US dollars I need to get one Aussie dollar. But from the perspective of the Australian resident, that is an indirect way of coding, agree? Because it is talking about, how much my one Aussie dollar is worth in terms of US dollars. And the scale, the relevant scale for the nominal US dollar, Aussie dollar exchange rate is given on the right. Okay? So what this means would be, say for instance, we're looking at around July 2008 over here. Okay? So can you see where my mouse pointer is currently located? Okay, so over here, July 2008. So what this would mean is, if we check against the vertical axis, the exchange rate would be roughly 0.98 or 0.99 per Australian dollar, right? 0.99 USD for one AUD. Okay, so that's how you interpret. So it's like very close to parity. Now, what about if we were to look at it from the perspective of, say, in October 2008, let's say somewhere around here. So what would be the exchange rate then? There will be around 0.6869, okay? So it means in October 2008, it's roughly 0.69 US dollars for one Aussie dollar. Right, 0.69 USD per AUD. So, what do these numbers tell us? Has the US dollar increased in terms of its strength, increased in terms of its purchasing power, or has it decreased in terms of its purchasing power? The US dollar has increased in terms of its purchasing power, right? Because what happens is, any US resident will require less US dollars in order to get one Aussie dollar. So Aussie dollar has become relatively cheap. And this would also imply that the Aussie dollar has fallen in value, right? Now, in the terminology of foreign exchange markets, we would use the terms appreciation and depreciation. And so in this context, we can talk about appreciation and depreciation. So the US dollar has actually appreciated from July 2008 to October 2008, whereas for the Aussie dollar, it has depreciated in that same period. Okay. So what is the magnitude of the change? Well, from 1 up until around 0.7, that is like more than 30% change, right? Yeah, so there's a 30% change within that span of 3 months. And it seems to indicate that during the global financial crisis, US dollars are actually in greater demand. And people are actually fleeing the Aussie dollar and parking their funds in US dollar denominated assets. The US dollar has actually increased in strength. Now note that when we're talking about this exchange rate, we're talking about a nominal exchange rate. What does nominal mean? Nominal means what you have in terms of its stated value, okay, its face value. And this is in contrast to the idea of the real exchange rate. Real exchange rate would take into account the relative purchasing powers or the relative prices in both countries. Over here, we are only talking about one currency against the other, but we still haven't talked about the prices of goods and services in two countries yet. Okay? So this is only the nominal exchange rate. It hasn't taken into account the real purchasing power of the two currencies. If you want to compute that, what happens is you need to take into account the relative prices of the goods and services in both countries. And once you are able to obtain that, you should be able to come up with something called the real exchange rate. Now, the concept of real exchange rate will be covered in the next few lectures. So you don't have to worry about it at this moment. But suffice to say that every time you hear what is reported in the news, those are actually nominal exchange rates. What are reported, the things that are being reported based on the face value. Okay? But they are not real exchange rate because they haven't taken into account the prices of goods and services. Okay, now what about this thing called the VIX Volatility Index? And its scale is given on the left-hand side. The left vertical axis. What is this VIX Volatility Index? Anyone would like to hazard a guess what the VIX is? Where would you be able to obtain the VIX? And what does the VIX measure? If you were to go for an interview to, let's say, a financial institution, and they ask you this question, what is VIX? You're not going to keep quiet, right? What is VIX? And what does it measure? And how useful is it? Well, from time to time, it's reported in the media. They talk about the VIX. So what is VIX? What is volatility? Well, volatility basically measures fluctuations, right? And markets fluctuate. So we want to be able to have some kind of a gauge as to how financial markets fluctuate. Now, why are we interested in market fluctuations? Because they represent inherent risks, right? If markets fluctuate persistently, then this may mean that there's a lot of risk involved if you are doing short-term investments or maybe doing speculation. Right? So in some sense, volatility of the markets would actually tell us how markets are actually performing in terms of the risk assessment, in terms of their risk. So this VIX is actually devised by the Chicago Board of Exchange. And what they do is they would use the options that are actually being attached to the S&P 500 index and compute some kind of a volatility index from there. Now, for those of you who have taken the course FinAm 7041, derivatives, you would have learned that when it comes to looking at option prices, one of the factors that you need to pay attention to would be volatility of the underlying asset. Okay? So for instance, if you have an option that's being written against the S&P 500 index, then one factor that will influence the option price would be the volatility of the S&P 500 index. And other things being equal, the higher the volatility of the S&P 500 index, the higher would be the price of that option, right? And that is in 7041. But let's go back to this idea about the volatility index. Now, this volatility index is actually a very good measure of how much risk there is in the market. Okay? It is often used as a barometer of the amount of risk that people have, or risk perception. Okay? So if the volatility index were low, then typically people would think that market sentiment is quite good. It's optimistic. Okay? But if the volatility index VIX is very high, then it means that market sentiment has deteriorated quite substantially. And there is a lot of risk aversion in the markets. So traders, market participants in general, they are not so optimistic about investments. They tend to become more risk averse in terms of the investment strategies that they adopt. Okay, so this VIX is a very good barometer, a very good measure of how much risk there is and the risk perception of the global financial markets in general. And if you look at what is happening, okay, at the height of the crisis, around 2008, the VIX is very high. So this indicates that global risk aversion during the global financial crisis is really high indeed. Okay? So we see that there is some kind of inverse relationship between the nominal US dollar, Aussie dollar exchange rate and the VIX. Any questions at this point? Okay. If there are no questions, what I would like to mention at this point is the figures that I have provided between slides 5 and 8, or I should say 5 to 7. It's based on the publication by the Bank for International Settlements in April 2007. In fact, it's April 2007. So for the latest update, what you can do is you can go to the Bank for International Settlements website. And let me try and magnify this so that you can see it. Okay. So the Bank for International Settlements, otherwise known as BIS, it will publish regular surveys on how the foreign exchange markets are performing. So if you do a quick Google search, you should be able to find this. Their website is www.bis.org. Okay. So they publish this central bank survey of foreign exchange and OTC derivatives markets every 3 years. And I believe the latest report that we have is 2016. And it will be backdated to maybe a few months before the end of 2016. And if you click on this link called foreign exchange turnover, what happens is they would explain in a fairly non-technical sense what is happening to the foreign exchange markets recently. or rather in the past 3 years. So the figures that I've got in the lecture slides are based on the 2007 report. For the 2016 report, you can refer to this, and let me just quickly go through it. So this will be the Triennial Central Bank Survey as at April 2016. So if you click on the link, you should be able to get this. It's a fairly accessible article, so it's not very technical. And what happens is they will do a summary of what is happening to foreign exchange market activity in the past 3 years. So if you were to become a financial analyst in, let's say, the international finance departments of financial institutions, what happens is you may be asked to do research, and you have to read quite a lot of reports. And some of the reports that may be of relevance to you would be reports coming from the Bank for International Settlements. So their highlights can be found in this summary. And one point to take note of, even as of 2017, is the comment that they have made with regard to the US dollar. So apparently, the US dollar is still considered the dominant vehicle currency. Okay? It's a safe haven currency, but it's also called a vehicle currency. So what do we mean by a vehicle currency? A vehicle currency would be the case in which that currency is being used to settle all kinds of trade and finance transactions between any two countries, and these two countries are not necessarily the United States. Okay? So for instance, maybe between Malaysia and Hong Kong, or Malaysia and Singapore, or Malaysia and Australia. So traders, okay, from these two countries, they may want to settle their trades, settle their invoices using the US dollar. And that is why the US dollar is known as the vehicle currency. Okay? It's meant as a vehicle to settle trades. And the US dollar still remains quite supreme, okay? Despite the fact that a lot of people have mentioned that this currency is going downhill, and eventually it would depreciate and would be taken over by other currencies. But as of 2016, it still is the case that the US dollar remains to be the dominant currency in global financial markets. Okay? So for those of you who are interested in understanding recent developments in the foreign exchange markets, you can go through this report. Okay. Let me go back to the slides. So we've looked at how markets worked, and at the same time, I've also explained how we would use notation in terms of denoting any exchange rate. We've also talked about the common currencies. So the next thing that we would like to discuss would be the people in this market. Okay? Ultimately, they're the buyers and sellers of the different kinds of currencies. And they are the ones that would determine how the prices of these currencies would evolve, right? How they would move in future. Okay? So they are the ones that would determine the dynamics of exchange rates. And that has to do with the fact that they are the ones that would influence the forces of market demand and supply. So if you think about foreign exchange market, it actually comprises two tiers. One is known as the wholesale market, and the other one is known as the retail market. Now this should be quite straightforward to understand if we think about it in terms of analogies in our daily lives, right? So think about, let's not talk about currencies for the time being. Let's think about, say, apples, oranges, fresh fruits, okay? The things that you buy from Coles, right? We have Coles in Canberra Civic. So what happens is these fresh produce they represent the retail market, right? What Coles is selling you. They represent the retail market because this is what you buy from them, right? But what they would do, what Coles would do is it would get in touch with the suppliers of these fresh produce, okay? And they would get the goods from them, maybe pay them in bulk, and that segment of the market would represent the wholesale market, right? That's the wholesale market. Okay? So in between the, let's say, supermarkets and the main suppliers, that represents the wholesale segment of the fresh produce market. And then the retail market would be people like us going to Coles to buy fresh fruits like apples, oranges, what have you. Okay? Now, likewise, in the context of foreign exchange market, in which different currencies are being bought and sold at the same time, we have two different levels. One would be known as the interbank or wholesale market. So the interbank or wholesale market would be the transactions involving the different banks. Okay? For instance, NAB, okay, the National Australian Bank, and maybe Commonwealth. What they do is they may have interbank transactions involving foreign exchange. Okay? So that represents the wholesale sector, the wholesale market. Now, what about the client or retail market? That would be like we going to, let's say, Westpac, and we say, oh, I want to buy some US dollars. Could you do some exchange for me? So what happens is you have Aussie dollars in your wallet, and you want to exchange for US dollars. So you are effectively buying US dollars from them and selling Aussie dollars to them. And that segment represents the retail market. And then within these two tiers, we have four broad categories of participants. So we have the bank and non-bank foreign exchange dealers. So these are institutional participants. Okay? And they're dominated by large international banks. So what are some examples of large international banks? I guess Citibank, HSBC, and banks with a lot of international operations. They would qualify as large international banks. Okay. Then we also have the individuals and firms that are conducting commercial or investment transactions. Okay. People like you and I, we would go to the banks to exchange currency. Firms, if they have multinational operations, what they would do is they would also need to exchange currencies in order to settle their debts. Okay. Then we also have people who are like the intermediaries. So they stand ready to do buying and selling of different kinds of currencies. So these are the foreign exchange brokers. Okay. Finally, we have the government, or I should say the non-international banks, the non-financial institutions, the central banks. They would represent another category of participants. So examples of central banks would be like the Reserve Bank of Australia, RBA, Reserve Bank of Australia, the Federal Reserve in the United States, and the Bank of England in the United Kingdom. So these are central banks. And other examples in Asia, they will include Monetary Authority of Singapore, Monetary Authority of Hong Kong, right? Or I should say Hong Kong Monetary Authority. That's how they call it. Okay, so these are examples of central banks, and they are sort of like government representatives in the FAM. Okay. Now, given these different tiers and different segments, we would have different kinds of prices for the same currency. So most likely, the interbank exchange rate for, let's say, the Aussie dollar against the Kiwi, it's going to be different from the exchange rate between the Aussie dollar and the Kiwi in the retail sector. So most likely, we're going to see different kinds of exchange rates, even for the same pair of currencies. Okay. Now, let's use our intuition at this point. Which rate do you think would be more favorable? Okay. In other words, which rate would give cheaper prices for a foreign currency? The interbank or the client? The interbank, right? Most likely the interbank or the wholesale market, the participants would exchange one currency for another at more favorable rates. Right? It's like the wholesale market. Whereas for the client or the retail market, what happens is these participants, they want to earn more profits, so typically they would charge less favorable exchange rates. Okay? So if you look at exchange rates between the interbank rates and the retail market rates, you'll realize that the interbank rates tend to be the most favorable. Okay? Or in other words, the foreign currency would tend to be would be the cheapest. Okay? If you're thinking about any foreign currency in mind, that would tend to be the cheapest according to the interbank rate. And then for other kinds of retail rates associated with that same currency, they tend to be less favorable. Now, where can we check out rates? Well, one example that I have over here is from Oz Forex, and they do give the buying and the selling prices of different exchange rates for the same pair of currencies. Another example that I would like to show you at this point on the internet would be this one, Oanda. Okay. www.oanda.com. Okay. In fact, this is a website that I would use quite often when I travel overseas or I need to do some exchange of currencies, because I want to check, which rates are considered favorable and which rates would be considered, which banks are offering the most favorable rates. Okay. So typically, what I'll do is I'll use this as a basis to do my comparison. And what happens is if you go to this website, okay, www.oanda.com, you should be able to get to the different tools that would help you locate the buying and selling prices of the exchange rates. And this currency converter or this calculator that they have is very useful because it not only allows you to pick all kinds of currencies that you like. It asks for the currency that you have versus the currencies that you want to buy. It also allows you to look at the different kinds of rates in the market for the same pair of currencies or for any currency that you are interested in. So they have the interbank rate, and the interbank rate would be the cheapest rate, and you can specify it for any month or any day of the year. Okay? And if you want to look at what happens in terms of other retail rates that are available in the markets, click on this drop-down menu, and you have different kinds of possibilities. So what happens is banks that sell and buy currencies, they would add some kind of a percentage on top of the price or the exchange rate in order to earn profits. And depending on whether you are using different means of exchanging currencies with the banks, you will be charged differently from the interbank rate. Okay. So for instance, if you were to go overseas, you have an Australian bank ATM card, you want to withdraw cash from an overseas ATM, then maybe you could be charged the typical ATM rate overseas. So you could be charged an extra 2% on top of the interbank rate that prevails then. If you're using credit cards overseas, typically they may charge 3% on top of it. So for those of you who have credit cards, you may realize that some banks will tell you, oh, if you use our credit cards overseas, then what happens is you'll be charged a 3% surcharge on top of the amount that you have spent. Okay? And that's based on the maybe the Aussie dollar amount, for instance. Okay? And the most expensive rates are typically the ones that you would find from exchange rate kiosks. So these are like shops that are available maybe in shopping malls. And I think even in Australia Post, I think they have Amex as the avenue for you to exchange currency. So you could get the dollars and notes immediately. And these are the typical kiosk rates. The typical kiosk rates would be a bigger percentage on top of the interbank rate. So those tend to be the most expensive ones. Okay, so that is it in terms of the retail market and how it differs in terms of its rates from the interbank or wholesale market. So let's just take a look at the bank and non-bank dealers. Okay. So the dealers will act as something like a market maker. In other words, they make the market. For those of you who have some exposure to concepts like market microstructure, you have heard about this term called market maker. Essentially, this term called market maker means that it is some kind of an agent or an entity that would stand ready to buy on both sides of the markets, to buy and sell currencies. So they make the market. Okay? So they're willing to buy or sell currencies without a counterpart to unload their inventory. So typically these dealers, they have currency inventories. So they have inventories of different currencies. Maybe they may be holding, say, 1 million Aussie dollars, 1 million Kiwi dollars, or maybe 1 million US dollars, in order to facilitate the buying and selling of currencies. In other words, to make the market. And how do they make profits? Well, they make profits from something called the difference between the buying and the selling prices. Okay. So in FinAM's 7006, I think typically you'll be told that the asset has a single price. Okay. And then based on that single price, you try to compute different kinds of things to see whether that asset price is actually at equilibrium value. Right? This is something that you might have learned in FinAM 7006. But what happens is, in reality, any asset that is being bought and sold in financial markets, there are two different prices. There is a buying price, so it's a price in which the dealer would buy that asset from you, and there is also a selling price at the same time, and that would be the offer price or the ask price. So it's the price that they will sell it to you. So if you think about any asset in general, what happens is the buying price will typically be lower than the selling price. Now you have to think about this from the perspective of the dealer if you want to be consistent and not make mistakes. Because the buying price that is being quoted by the dealer is actually from the counterparty, the selling price, right? It's just like, if the dealer were to buy, say, 1 Aussie dollar from you, it's actually selling you another currency. Let's just say the US dollar. And what you are doing, from your perspective, if you are conducting this transaction, is you are buying US dollar, and then you're selling the Aussie dollar to the dealer. It's the opposite. Okay? Is that clear? Right? It's the opposite. So when you think about this buying and selling prices, make sure you think about it consistently. Okay? You think about it maybe from the perspective of the dealer, or think about it from the perspective of the customer. Then you will not mix up. If not, your results may be incorrect. Okay? So when we talk about buying and selling currencies, we have bid and ask prices. And what happens is, it may involve arbitrage and speculative activity. So for instance, if the bank were to buy Aussie dollars from you, it sells US dollars to you, then effectively you're buying the US dollars and selling the Aussie dollars, right? And you may be involved in some kind of arbitrage or speculative activity. So how can we make profits from these activities? Well, there could be potential profits to be made, and this is something that we'll cover more formally in topic 5. Now, different dealers will most likely offer different bid and ask prices for any currency that they are buying and selling. Okay? So if you check the websites of, let's say, Commonwealth Bank, NAB, ANZ, what have you, you realize that they have different buying and selling prices. But in reality, these differences will become very small. And that is because there's a lot of competition going on amongst those dealers. They want your business. So that would help to narrow the spread between the bid and the ask prices. And this contributes to market efficiency. Now, the foreign exchange market is actually considered a very efficient market because what happens is nowadays a lot of trading is being done online. And it's facilitated by sophisticated communication systems and advanced computer technology. So a lot of these buying and selling prices, they change very quickly, and you're able to look at how those changes are evolving as markets are trading. And this is a very special market in the sense that it is a market that is almost 24/7. What do I mean by almost 24/7? If you think about it, given the different time zones that we have throughout the world, and the fact that everyone would be having some kind of demand and supply for different currencies during the trading period, it's not hard to imagine that this market is going to work almost like a 24/7 kind of market. So typically, a typical trading day for the foreign exchange market would typically start in New Zealand and Australia because their time zones are very much ahead of the rest of us, right? So markets would open in Australia and New Zealand, and then 2 or 3 hours later, the markets in Singapore, Hong Kong, China, and the rest of Asia, they will also start their trading. Right? So Japan, China, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Singapore, they will start the trading of currencies. And then maybe 6 to 7 hours later, the markets in Europe, such as France, Germany, they will also start their trading at the same time. And you'll realize that as time goes by, some of the markets would close because it's the end of the trading day. But other markets will start to open because it's the start of the trading day. Then it moves to England, and then it moves across the Atlantic Ocean to the East Coast and then the West Coast of the United States. So this market seems to function 24/7, almost 24/7. And typically, if the financial institution has a lot of dealings in foreign exchange, they may have staff members that will remain in the office to do trading after hours. Okay? They may have to do night shifts in order to check what the markets are doing, how the markets are performing in the other markets that are still trading in the rest of the world. Okay? So this is like an almost 24/7 market. And if you think about the time zone, this would mean that foreign exchange operations or transactions would most likely stop, say, on Saturday in Australia, because that would be Friday evening, the day before, in New York and the rest of the United States. So these banks, they typically would have a lot of sophisticated communication systems that would work almost 24/7 in order to facilitate trades. And a lot of these commercial banks will maintain demand deposits with one another, and that will facilitate the efficient functioning of the market. Okay, why do these banks, they have all these demand deposit accounts that would hold different foreign currencies? Well, what happens is, depending on their operations and objectives, different banks may want to hold different inventories of currencies. So they may want to hold on to more or less, and they may think that other banks may help in terms of economies of scale. So if they have some kind of shortfall in terms of, let's say, one currency, they may want to be able to borrow it from another bank where they have relationships. And that is why a lot of these commercial banks, they will maintain accounts with one another in order to maintain this network. And it is considered mutually beneficial in that sense. Okay, now this is about the impact of GFC on the bid-ask spreads. Now, given that we have less than 1 minute left, What I would like to suggest is that we'll defer the discussion of this slide to next Tuesday. Okay, so we'll continue next Tuesday to look at what is the impact of the GFC on the bid-ask spreads.